I am so prepared that even without God, I can pass. That was the first time that I had issues with my scores.
You are now listening to the personal story segment of What Is Your Story podcast. What Is Your Story is a cultural project by Nosy Podcast that is dedicated to telling African stories. Our goal is to create a space where anyone can come and share the truth. Do you have a story to share?
Hi, my name is Nora, and this is my story. I was raised in the Kukuruku Hills of Igara by parents who approached religion more as a tool than a conviction. Growing up, my parents didn't go to church, and I sometimes went alone or in the company of my siblings. I'm the last child of 5 siblings, and my home was a drift between peace, anarchy, and most times a magnitude of chaos. You know that thing that happens when there's really no anchor, but just helter-skelter, troubleshooting and solving issues as they arise. We didn't celebrate birthdays in my family. My father saw it as a waste of money. We celebrated festive seasons like Christmas, where he would want all the children to come together and have a good time. To him, that was how family should operate, gathering during festive seasons. I observed that my elder brother, who is the only male child in the family, so we're 5, 4 girls and 1 boy. My elder brother, who is the first child, was usually very distant from the family, and on most Christmas, he would be around, but not really be around. Whenever he was around, he spent most of his time in church, evangelizing and bringing his friends home, who were all Christians. And my father used to scoff at him as being religious and fanatical, and that affected me in several ways. I didn't want to be like him. I wanted to be my father's favorite child. I wanted to be not fanatical, not religious, just me. And that in itself was one of the greatest issues I faced, because how can you not have an anchor? How can you not have a relationship with a creator? How can you not learn about these things very early in life? My parents sought God and other gods in their own ways and for their own means. Cool. My earliest childhood memory in primary school was having a deep sense of affection for God because of the quality of songs that were played in my class. There were songs that made me realize that God could go any length, just to save me. There were songs that made me want to be close to God. And when I did go to church, I listened attentively and learned basic things about God, about the 12 disciples, about salvation experiences. However, in all of this, I did not really have that personal relationship with God because I needed someone to actually show me the way. And even though my elder brother was showing others the way, I was blind to the way because of parental influence. In secondary school, my first encounter with features of God was a classmate who mentioned in her speech that God was a jealous God. That was the first time I was hearing about God in that way. So I wondered why she would say that. She nodded, insisting God is a jealous God. I remember thinking, mulling those words in my heart and wondering how God could be, how God, who is up there, who is a deity, as I learned in Christian religious studies and other forms of literature and mythology in social studies, would be a jealous God, like she said. However, when I go home, I didn't ask a question. I mean, there was always one thing or the other to talk about other than God, and I felt it wasn't necessary. And so I grew up like that. I remember my first encounter with God was in my junior secondary school exams. So I had read so hard, and while myself and my niece and nephew were on our way to the farm, they questioned if I was prepared for the exam. And I said, yes, I am so prepared that even without God, I can pass. Yeah, I said that to them. And that was the first time that I had issues with my scores. Every other person had their results in JS3. Mine was seized. Yeah. And that didn't stop me from having that nonchalant attitude towards God. I continued my journey. And because I was zealous, intelligent, and smart, in my secondary school, I was made the assistant senior girl. I remember going into classes, junior classes, to teach them, to spend time with them. And I asked them about their goals and wrote mine on the board. And a child then said to me, "You're writing all these things and you're not adding by the grace of God." She said, "Our CRS teacher told us that whatever you do, you have to say by the grace of God." So I looked at her and said, "What would God do for me? I can do all these things by myself." And something happened and I was removed as the assistant senior girl of the school. Yeah. So I've had lots and lots of encounters. But in all of this, because I was blind, because I wasn't introspective, because I wasn't meditating, because I wasn't paying attention to details, I was not seeing that for every action, there was a reaction, and for everything I did, there was a consequence. When it was time to actually choose my career, there was conflict. I remember wondering if I should be in science or art class. I knew I loved literature. I knew I loved English language because growing up as a child, beautifully written fiction was my chocolate, and comprehensive passages in English textbooks drew me in a way that further maths and mathematics did not apply. My teacher said to me, "Nora, you're very intelligent. You'll be a great ambassador. Study international relations." My sister said to me, "You're very fluent in your speech. Why don't you do mass comm? However, if you do mass comm, you may not have time for your family. And I don't know how much you'll be paid because you don't earn so well." And then my sister, who had been around activists, lawyers, and politicians, said to me, "I know of a particular course that will make you very important in society, and that is law." That was it. My fate was sealed. I decided I was going to be a lawyer. Not because I wanted to help the society, not because I wanted to be an activist, but because I wanted to be important. So law for me was a tool to be an important person, and that was it. It was when I wrote my JAM that I realized that passing in one sitting, like I prayed, because I actually prayed to God that I wanted to pass in one sit. So it's sort of a conflict. I grew up not believing in God, but then I grew up believing in prayers, and then I prayed and God answered my every prayer, and I got into school as early as age 16. But there was this emptiness I felt navigating my way through school because of the way I was raised. Because I was raised by parents who were very critical of achievements and what amounted to success. I was always desiring to go past each goal with the dexterity of somebody who will stop at nothing but excellence and still not let that sink in before pursuing the next line of goal. I do remember suffering from mental exhaustion, grappling with suicidal thoughts, wondering why, in spite of good grades and being the point of reference both in and out of my faculty, everything felt meaningless. I mean, the book of Ecclesiastic is so real. There's actually nothing that is meaningful outside purpose and knowing who you are, why you're here, and where you're going. It's at that point that I began to have internal struggles, conflict, and for each conflicts and struggle, my answer was reading more, studying more, making better grades. In the university, I lived a triangular life from my hostel, which was off campus in Ihumudumu in Ekuma, to the law library in the Faculty of Law, to classrooms, to the market if I had to shop for groceries, and back home. And that circular life robbed me of the beauty of a social life and the beauty of having friends who were not within my faculty. However, my goals were achieved. I left school as the best graduating student of the Faculty of Law 2012 with a CGPA of 4.3. I should have been happy, right? But it didn't make me happier. So yes, I was happy that I was a point of reference once more, and there were gifts that I was awarded. But deep within me, I was still feeling very empty. So empty that I knew that I was on a downward spiral to a place of no return. And while I was drowning in those emotions, those conflicting emotions, I met somebody who showed me a way that was superior. So during my university, I met someone who led me to Christ. Her name is Itel. She taught me how to pray. She taught me to believe in God. She taught me that the world was my kitchen and that as long as I had faith, I could be anything I wanted to be. I learned also about demonology and how the enemy would always try to snatch my peace and do things to terrify me. But as long as I knew who my father was, I mean, that was the first time I knew God was my father. Like I could have a relationship with him and call him father. That was the first time I was hearing about it. That all would be fine. I remember then that we were contributing for a particular gospel artist to come to a crusade in school. And so I asked her, "Why are we contributing?" And she said, "Because we want God to be glorified." At that point, I remember dropping something into the plate. And she said I could pray any prayer. And so I prayed. My sister at the time needed to find a placement in the Wabalada Teaching Hospital. And I wanted her to not just get a placement there, but also to get a place to live. And God came through for her. And she shared that testimony with me. And I knew God had answered my prayers. So it was now a back and forth of praying and getting really speedy answers. And I'll also go out there and evangelize and talk to people. I do remember coming across back then an undergraduate who was 2 years beneath my class, who was dabbling into another kind of religion. And we got talking.
Hi there. Just a reminder, Noisy Podcast is on a mission to publish and promote authentic African stories. If you've got a story to tell, we'd love for you to join us. Simply click the link in the description to sign up. You can also share your stories anonymously and submit through our Google form, where it will be brought to life through narration. Plus, we do group stories, a collective story concept that will feature a small group of people with a similar story. And don't forget to stay with us on social media. On Instagram, we are at whatisyourstory_podcast. And on Twitter, we're at WIYS_podcast. Follow us to stay up to date with all of our activities and upcoming episodes.
I explained to him my experience, how far I'd come, what I was experiencing, the peace in my heart. He listened so attentively and thanked me. I felt fulfilled that I was able to pass across the information that I had to others and that it was making an impact in them. I started reading books by Kennedy Hagin on healing, on forgiveness, spirit within and spirit upon. And I remember having so much faith within me. I do recall that after law school, I was led to the city of Ocean State for my youth service, and thereafter Ibadan, where I started work. Ibadan happens to be a beautiful city that connected me to 3 pillars of my life. My first principal was not just a lawyer, but a man of God, and whose ethics in the profession and discipline with which he executed practice impacted me. My foster grandmother, who happened to be my friend's grandmother, who took me in when I had nowhere to stay, and also my husband, who met me through a friend. I remember leaving Ibadan for Lagos after marriage. I remember that even before I left, my principal was usually in awe of how I would put aside practice notes and legal textbooks and stay glued on my laptop drafting scripts and stories. He told me that I would actually be better at legal practice if I paid more attention to the details, but he observed that I had interest in other places. And so there's always been a struggle between writing and lawyering. It all goes back to the fact that I studied law because I wanted to be important, remember? And not because I wanted to be a lawyer. And to be honest, law has opened a lot of doors for me. Even as a member of the Association of Nigerian Authors, I've been endeared to lots of members, both within and outside that circle, by simply using the magic word, I'm a lawyer. And learning the rudiments of practice and also knowing how to do most of the things I do as a lawyer has also opened sources of income for me that I would ordinarily not have. However, I have also observed that I do not have the same passion that I have for writing as I have for legal practice. And yes, I'm a great lawyer, but my desire is to put more interest into what I love doing so that then I can use it as a means to actually reform my society. Storytelling has always been what I was born to do because I do it with so much ease and it brings so much joy to me. I published my first book titled Warm Embrace in 2017. While I was in Ibadan as a lawyer, I reached out to Evans Publishers. I wanted them to publish the book for me, but it took them 2 years to actually revert, within which I had already published my book. I self-published my book. I know that thing about self-published book, right? I did not have all the tools I needed. I remember sending the manuscript to an editor who returned the book to me and said there were no errors. And I knew then that something was wrong because there's no such thing as a perfect story without an error. And when I went on to print, I recall having lots of criticism from my readers who loved the story but wished that I had used a good editor. My greatest joy was I was a published author, and my father told me that I was the first in my village to be an author, and that made me very proud. And I went on to publish my second book. My pastor's wife at the time was my informal editor. She would go through the books for me, point to errors, tell me to shift the narrative arc in a way, and also point me to some structural defects. She wasn't an editor, but she did give my work some attention, and that also added value to my stories. I do recall a particular child who approached me and told me she had read my book 5 times because it gave her so much joy. And I recall a pastor from Delta State reaching out to me to say that a child had a struggle with her father, and that when she read my book, she began to question herself if she wanted to hold on to the bitterness or she wanted to let go and forgive. Because in my books, I explore things like healing, forgiveness, salvation, healing from pain and trauma, restoring identity, navigating differences in culture and religion with wisdom, learning to choose peace over conflict, salvation, and the beauty of discovering God personally. And that itself has kept me going because I do not just want to be a writer who is a New York Times bestseller. While that is something I aspire to, much more than that, I want to leave seeds in the hearts of the next generation on how to commune with their creator and how to navigate their journey in life as a pilgrim on earth. I write to make sure that no young reader grows up like I did, reading everything except the truth that could set them free. I write because generations are waiting for voices that speak courage, clarity, love, and direction. I write because children deserve stories that shape them into whole, grounded, spiritually healthy individuals. I write because Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, and through writing, I get to point hearts towards Him. As a self-publisher, I've had my own fair share of struggles. I am unknown, except by those in my inner circle, in my outer circle, by friends and family that know one another. And I wonder how my books will travel to worlds and places that I've never been. I've envied the likes of Masube and Parisha and Narrative Landscape, and I have at one time or the other wished I was published by them. But then I do recall that a lot of them hold this ideology of not wanting to destroy literature with religion. The beauty about writing in this way is that my unique selling point is not just the beauty with which I craft my stories, but the way of life that I show to the next generation that other books do not have. In resolving conflicts in my stories, I ensure that the protagonist knows that he or she is carried by grace and not by will or their own strength. I ensure that moral values that I have come to understand as a Christian also shapes the realities. And so you can't find children reading my book and wondering if stealing, as long as they're not caught, is the right thing to do. At the just concluded Aki Festival, I observed that most of the books that are celebrated were books that were consciously and conscientiously written and given time to actually become masterpieces. So I said to myself, there has to be a removal of haste from my spirit. I recall that before Evans Publishers reached out to me, I had already published. So I wondered if I had waited, would I have been able to overcome the issues I faced in terms of having the wrong editors and also not being able to distribute the books because I was limited. Though I have met booksellers who have actually confided in me that most of these publishers actually reap their authors or profits. But I really would not have minded having some form of mentorship and covering as a budding author. I've been a published author for as long as 8 years now. And the next phase for my life is ensuring that these stories that I'm so passionate about goes beyond Africa to the world that I may never traverse, but where children who need to hear these truths are waiting and yearning with hearts that needs to be formed, just like mine was before I started. Thank you all for listening to my story.
Thank you for listening to this episode of What is Your Story podcast. Every week, we share a new story from ordinary people across Africa. We release new episodes by 8 a.m. every Monday, and our podcast is available everywhere you get your podcasts. If you enjoy this episode, please leave a comment, like, or share the episode. Don't forget to follow us to stay up to date. Follow our social media. We are at whatisyourstory_podcast on Instagram and WIYS_podcast on Twitter. See you same time next week.